Before we delve in fully to this bizarre and frightening case, it's worth fast-forwarding right to the nuts and bolts of the dramatic incident to just try to get into the mindset of what it must have been like. Imagine what must have gone through the mind of the victim as it all unfolded. One minute your client comes for a beauty treatment and brings you some delicious cheesecake. The next minute you're unconscious and fighting for your life. Obviously, there is much, much more to all of this, and we have lots of dramatic details to unpack. So without further ado, let's head in for the deep dive. Victoria Nasirova may not be your archetypal ruthless and dangerous killer. She has deep brown eyes with dark flowing hair and an enticing magnetism and natural beauty. But do not let that fool you. The enigmatic Russian is flat out dangerous. She's meticulous, considered, and terrifyingly cold-blooded, as we'll find out. She's not the type who would commit a savage attack with a weapon, leaving a bloody and horrific mess in her wake. That's not her style. She's much more calculating than that. But the results are no less devastating. Something that Olga Zvik found out to her peril in August of 2016. Olga Zvik was a beauty technician at a nearby salon and frequently did eyelash extensions for Victoria. She was a regular client of Olga's and had a tendency to be very pushy. She had been suggesting for some time that the two of them should spend some time together outside the salon in a social capacity. However, this wasn't really something that Olga was keen to do. She was very professional and wanted to ensure there was no overlap between her business and her social life. Her clients were her clients, and her friends were her friends, so she politely declined to see Victoria outside of work. However, when she received a call from Victoria, who said that she urgently needed her eyelashes sorting as it was an emergency, she felt obliged to help and subsequently agreed to let her client come to her home for the urgent appointment, something she had never ever done before. She couldn't help but feel that the whole thing felt a little bit odd, with something not quite feeling right. Adding to the strangeness of the whole situation was the striking similarity the two women had for each other. It was uncanny how much they looked alike, and although this may just have appeared to be an unlikely coincidence at the time, it proved to be a very significant and poignant significance. Her feeling of unease only grew when Victoria knocked on her door. As she stood on the doorstep of Olga, she wasn't empty-handed. With her, she brought what she described as the best cheesecake in New York. As a Brooklyn native, the high praise for the baked goods sounded perfectly legitimate and even enticing. That was the point. But bear in mind that these two women weren't close friends at the time, so this was effectively just like a random client taking some cheesecake to somebody for an appointment or professional service. But as Victoria had continually tried to befriend Olga and become friendly outside the salon, she brought it under the guise of sharing a sweet treat between friends as they caught up on gossip and fixed her eyelashes. Be that as it may, Olga felt like she was already on the back foot and feeling out of her comfort zone. She found the gifted cheesecake as a slightly odd gesture, but took it at face value from one of her regular clients. The fact is that Olga had no reason or inclination to distrust the woman, which in many ways is what made her the perfect target for Victoria. After the initial greeting between the pair, Victoria insisted that Olga just had to try the cheesecake. After eating the alleged best cheesecake in New York, Olga immediately began to feel strange. She had never felt like this before and began to feel nauseous, dizzy, and out of control. She ultimately passed out and lost consciousness and was soon fighting for her life. Victoria had laced the cake with a potent and strong Russian tranquilizer drug called phenazepam. The sedative took hold of Olga immediately and caused violent and continuous vomiting before it ultimately knocked her out, far from the delicious treat she'd been promised by her wannabe friend. But at this point, it appeared there was more than just a singular strand to Victoria's devastating plan. Not only was her plan to kill Olga, but she planned to make it look like a suicide and would then steal her identity. There can be no doubt that it was a premeditated and sinister plot. The question then is why? Why would Victoria happen to befriend a woman who looked very similar to her, try to kill her, and then look to steal her identity? Well, much of the answer is in the question. As an investigation into the case continued to develop, new information came to light which started to paint a vivid picture, and the answer became pretty clear. Olga was far from her only victim, and the unassuming Russian appeared to be leaving a trail of bodies in her wake, all with very similar experiences to Olga. As more details emerged, it turned out that Victoria Nazarova was a very dangerous woman and wanted for murder by authorities. With the walls closing in, it appears as though she had one last-ditch attempt to evade detection and capture. She had to assume somebody else's identity. Enter Olga Tsvik. The two undoubtedly shared many physical similarities at the time, and of course both spoke Russian, meaning the innocent eyelash technician was a prime target for Victoria to manipulate and ultimately murder. Once Olga had passed out, it was almost as if that was when the sinister Victoria's real work began. The phenazepam drug is tasteless, so there was no way that Olga would have known that her piece of cheesecake had been poisoned. However, Victoria scattered a number of the pills around the stricken body of Olga to give the perception that she had killed herself. With Olga prone and unconscious, Victoria then stole all her money and her passport, ultimately completing the task of occupying her identity. Despite temporarily slipping into a coma, Olga made a full recovery following the incident, but she'd struggled to convince the police investigator about what happened. When she returned from hospital, she reported to the police that a number of possessions and cash were missing, but when detectives visited, she was still woozy and foggy from the incident, which led the investigators to question if she was a drug user of some sort. They found it hard to fully get behind the notion of what Olga was suggesting, who was quite clear in her mind that Victoria was up to something. As far as she was aware, she'd had some cheesecake, woke up in the hospital, came very close to dying, and returned home to find her passport, money, and other possessions all missing. It wasn't until the investigators ran some forensic tests on the cheesecake boxes, in addition to some further digging into Victoria's backstory, it became clear that they were dealing with something, and someone, very serious. As it turned out, Olga was the last in a long line of people who had suffered similarly at the hands of the Russian beauty. Some were petty theft, while some were far, far worse. After Olga returned to work at the salon, she was recounting her ordeal to one of her other clients. It was at that point that her client advised that one of her husband's friends had also been poisoned in what seemed like extremely similar circumstances. It was established that Victoria was posting ads on dating websites and was posing as an escort in quite a niche market. The man in question was Ruben Barukov. Ruben had found Victoria's profile on a specific site to find Russian women. He was an honest, humble local businessman who owned a dry cleaning store in the area. And as it turned out, he'd had his own brush with Victoria 2 months before Olga ate that cheesecake. Ruben made contact with Victoria on the dating site, and after she declared her love to cook, Ruben declared his love to eat, and so they arranged to meet at her place for dinner. But the dinner didn't last long, according to Ruben. After just one bite of fish, he immediately passed out and was completely unconscious. Victoria then went on a shopping spree, having stolen $1,000 in cash from her dinner date, as well as $2,400 on his American Express card. And he had no idea! 2 days later, and Ruben was still out of it. He was barely conscious and completely incoherent. She took him to his dry cleaning business and left him with his staff. She claimed they'd been drinking wine and he couldn't handle his alcohol, but Ruben remembers nothing after the first mouthful. His staff called an ambulance to come and take their boss to the hospital, but Victoria fled the scene before they arrived. However, not before she stole more money from the basement of his business unit and his watch. Much like Olga would experience in a couple of months' time, Ruben came very close to dying. However, the private investigator that had been tracking Victoria suggests that Olga and Ruben may actually have been the lucky ones. The PI was called Herman Weisberg and had been investigating Victoria Nazarova for some time. Weisberg stated that he had been working with a woman called Nadia Ford, who had reason to believe that Victoria Nazarova was behind the disappearance of her mother some years earlier. Where? In Russia. Nadia said that Victoria had moved next door to her mother and begun befriending her, despite the two women appearing to be very different types of people. They certainly weren't an obvious candidate to be friends. With Nadia in New York, her mom advised her that she was sending Victoria with gifts and presents for her as she was coming over. Apparently, $6,000 in cash in addition to other significant items like a fur coat. However, Victoria never showed up to meet her, and Nadia never got the stuff. But that wasn't all. One day when she tried to call her mother, there was no answer. This was something that hadn't happened in 8 years, and she'd spoken on the phone every single day. After trying to call over 100 times, she still couldn't get hold of her. Nadia was worried, and nobody had any clue where her mother was or what had happened to her. When Nadia started investigating herself, she checked her mom's mobile phone record online. The last call she received, you guessed it, Victoria Nazarova. Fearing the worst, Nadia returned to Russia to try to find out what had happened to her mother. She went to her apartment and confronted Victoria. Victoria was startled by the impromptu meeting and insisted her mother was alive. But after calling the local police to enter her mother's apartment, there was no sign of her. What was also clear is that the apartment had been looted. Nothing of value was there, and cash, cards, and valuables had all been stolen. Even her life savings of $40,000 had been taken, despite being kept in a secret hideaway. With her mother still nowhere to be seen, and Victoria now long gone, Nadia committed herself and her life to finding her mother and what had happened. She was seemingly getting nowhere in her investigations and little help or interest from the authorities. Until she had an idea. Traffic cameras on the Russian highway would maybe provide pictures that would help put the pieces of the puzzle together. After paying the right people and the right amount of money, she was able to obtain images from the traffic cameras, which showed her what she'd been looking for. On the day her mother disappeared, there was a blurry image that Nadia was adamant showed Victoria in the driver's seat and her mother as a passenger. When she called the police about this, the investigator confirmed they'd already seen the image and had traced the car the image was taken of back to a rental car the Victoria had indeed taken out. Just the validation that Nadia was looking for. Could her mother still be alive? Nadia tried to contact Victoria by phone and by text, and even offered her everything she owned in order to get her mother back. But she got nothing. Sometime later, she received the phone call she'd been dreading. It was a call from the authorities asking Nadia to come and identify some charred remains. There was nothing left of her mother to identify. That was until she saw the teeth. She recognized the teeth and had to heartbreakingly accept that they were, in fact, the teeth of her mother. By this time, Interpol had issued an international arrest warrant for Victoria Nazarova, a warrant for murder. With Victoria nowhere to be found, that's when Nadia enlisted the help of New York private investigator and former NYPD detective Herman Weisberg. Weisberg took to the social media site Facebook and found that Victoria wasn't being as clever as she thought. Despite an international arrest warrant being out for the Russian con artist, she was posting updates and pictures all over Facebook and checking into locations where she'd been. Weisberg studied the pictures meticulously and found she was giving away clues in her posts if you knew where and how to look. One such picture showed the reflection of the dashboard of the car she was in through her sunglasses, and also the type of leather interior of the car. Weisberg then went to the local train station and spent hours walking the parking lot, trying to identify the characteristics he'd seen to a make and model of a particular vehicle. After peering through the windows of thousands of cars, one such vehicle caught his eye. It was a Chrysler sedan. Having identified the car, he then had to find the specific car Victoria was driving. After heading back to Facebook, he noticed a number of likes by Victoria were clustered around a Russian neighborhood in Brooklyn. Weisberg and his team of investigators were miraculously able to track down the very same car that had been seen through the reflection of Victoria's Ray-Bans in the Facebook post. Not only the car, but after monitoring the area, they also saw Victoria herself, along with her boyfriend who owned the Chrysler. The astonishing thing? They lived just 4 blocks away from Nadia in Brooklyn. But the boyfriend she was living with would also later claim to be a victim of Victoria too, insisting that Victoria poisoned and killed his pet dog as it was getting too much attention. It was abundantly clear that not only was Victoria Nazirova unhinged, but she was dangerous. And the longer she went uncaptured, the greater likelihood of more deaths and suffering at her hands. Weisberg subsequently alerted the NYPD after Interpol and Homeland Security refused to take action. But the police had no such reluctance and arrested her as soon as they made their move. Everything fell into place for the investigator of Olga's Cheesecake mystery after that. With an international arrest warrant hanging over Victoria's head, she tried to kill Olga and assume her identity by stealing her passport. However, she couldn't outrun her past, and her previous crimes caught up with her. She was charged with attempted second-degree murder. Amongst other charges in 2017, Victoria was held in custody for 6 years as the global pandemic continually delayed the trial. When the trial finally began, the prosecution showed how an international arrest warrant for the murder of Nadia's mother in Russia, as well as an expiring visa, caused Victoria into desperation mode. Desperately trying to avoid returning to Russia to be tried for her crimes, she needed to do anything to stay in America. That meant murdering Olga and stealing her identity. However, it took the jury just 90 minutes to determine that Victoria was guilty of attempted second-degree murder. When sentencing came to pass, the judge decreed she was an extremely dangerous woman and sentenced her to 21 years in jail. Although good behavior could see Victoria out in 15 years, she will then be deported to Russia, where she will be tried for the murder of Nadia's mother. After so much pain and heartache caused at the hands of this calculating con artist, no amount of jail time can amount to the lifetime of hell that Nadia and Olga will forever have to live with.